Hello.
Welcome, welcome. Welcome, guys. We're just waiting for people to join, then we'll officially start. Thank you for joining us at noon on Thursday. It's almost lunch, I know. So I hope some of you have some food in front of you, or at least a coffee to drink. Hello. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll start. Jody, can you hear me fine? Hi, Jody. For the audience, I just want to know, because I think we have load shedding. Jody just went out, she's rejoining now, but I just want to, if you guys can say in the chat if you can hear me fine. Yes. Lovely, sorry. I was talking and Jody didn't respond, but I think
Yes,
sorry? If you just joined, we just Jody, there's load shedding where Jody's at, so she's just rejoining. So I do apologize, and we'll start in a second. And if my internet's, there we go. Jody's back. Perfect.
Sorry about that. I got load shed, so I have to just join with my phone connection.
Okay, I mean, it's 12 o'clock, it's 3 minutes past 3, so I think we'll start, Jody.
Sure.
Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone can see the presentation. Just a quick confirmation. Jody, can you see the presentation?
I can, yeah.
Sorry, I don't trust my own technical capabilities, nor do I trust Zoom, so I always have to double check. You know, as the title suggests, it's 6 ways for the city of Cape Town under bold leadership to be the best one in the world. So we're not saying it is currently the best in the country nor in the world, but we're seeing there's an opportunity. So this event is part of Urban Festival. This is the second time that our future cities are hosting it and co-host of the South African Cities Network and different government departments. And I do apologize for the noise in the background. So, but there it goes, Jody again, but I'll start. So obviously we're hosting as Young Urbanists. So we are a youth organization that we're interested in the build, form and justice and equity in addressing apartheid special planning, but also carving out a contemporary African city or town around, you know, the climate change, biodiversity crisis, and also, you know, the acute social inequality and unemployment we face in our country. So this document was part of our advocacy to the local government elections on the ways in which the city of Cape Town can improve on metropolitan governance level, where, you know, things like urban design, policies, transportation, housing is used to not only create economic growth, but also to really show what can be done with the right bold leadership in council. Now, today I have Jody Alamaya joining me today. Jody, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself and I'll introduce myself and then I think we can start.
Sure. So my name is Jody Alamaya. I'm an independent city strategist, and I was one of the earlier members of Young Urbanists. I sort of consider myself an elder Young Urbanists now. And yeah, I had some input into this document sort of refining the concepts. Most of the work was done by some of the more active, young urbanists, but Roland has kindly asked me to help with the discussion on the document today.
Yes, I guess there's one thing, writing a document, but it's another thing being in governance and practice and the nitty-gritty of what it means to be an urbanist or planner. As a young organization, we have little experience. So yeah, thank you, Jody, for joining us, because obviously, it's one thing talking about the theoretical aspects of urbanism and planning, but it's another understanding the governance and the real life situation that evolves around planning. Now, I just want to ask the guests, please put any questions in the comment box. This is an organic discussion. There's no structure. We're going to go through the 6 ways. And then also we're going to share the full document. In this document, we're presented to different mayoral candidates. If some of you have been to the debate last night, that we did make a recording, we'll share that soon. And essentially this was part of that and our advocacy effort to really give a voice to young urbanists, but also to really tell those people in politics that planning can be used to create a better society that aligns with our constitution and the United Nations development goals. So I will share the document in a second, but as we can see, Jody, I don't know, do you want to quickly talk about this picture that's in the document?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, this image is an image of Mfuleni in Cape Town. It's always a nice one for me because it captures so many different things that sort of make up our cities, and different elements that we'll discuss. I think what's exciting about Mfuleni for me is the potential of future development and connection. So sort of midway through the image, you see what looks like a green belt. That's not actually a green belt, it's a rail reserve for a future rail connection called the Blue Downs Rail Link that would connect Khayelitsha to Bellville. And that's a major transport investment that would completely alter the sort of spatial form and ease of mobility in Cape Town, and that would make this a future transport node and catalyze all sorts of opportunities for different types of development in this area. So I like this image because it's an existing node. The city has invested already. You can see in the foreground in a range of social infrastructure. There's a library, a police station, a clinic right next to each other, and then obviously this sports infrastructure and a sort of a shopping center and things like that. And there's some informal trading and a taxi rank that you can sort of see in the foreground. So there's an existing community and things like that here, but there's also this huge potential for something quite bold and different to happen if that rail link ever were to come there. So for me, this image sort of represents an existing community, an existing place where people go about their ordinary lives. Lower middle income people go about their ordinary lives, but if you were to talk about a vision for a future Cape Town, there's something quite bold that could happen here as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. Apologies, sorry. I'm trying to upload a document and it seems you have to go through something else. So sorry, exactly. I think, with the Cape Town, we have a city of 2 tales. There's one in the city and then with a complete different city. So that kind of formal versus informal. But, there's always case studies, good case studies across the city and also across South Africa. Because sometimes we have this narrative that Cape Town is this and the rest of the country is X. So I think it's important that we can learn from all cities and towns, and then there's no perfect example, whether it's in the city ball, even outside of the city ball. So I'm going to share the document in a second, but we're going to go to the first point. But first, I just want to quickly, part of the document is that, as we go into the elections, we can really, the city of Cape Town and other cities and towns can really show how to really approach design, whether it's roads or neighborhoods, and also implementing existing policies, because I think we have a culture in our country where we have lots of great ideas and policies, but when it comes to implementation, there's a lack thereof, whether it's political will, whether it's urban governance, whether it's society, power dynamics, the list goes on and on. So I think for us, this is not just another document, but the emphasis of this document, it's actually about implementation on the metro level. So urban governance, how your administration, your maker members, how does that look like? And really to translate these ideas now, because there's an urgency in our society. And I think that that's something we all can agree on. We can't just wait another 5 years or 10 or 20 or a decade. But without further ado, I think we can go on to the next question. And again, any comments, please put them down. And Jody, please interrupt me, because sometimes I talk way too much. If I can do it. So Jody, I'm just going to read it out, and I think then I'm going to take it, then I'm going to give it over to you. This is something we've been really talking about, is visioning. So it's quite simple. We need a bold plan for bold change. So, I mean, Jody, from your experience in governance, what is, why do we talk about visioning? Do we have a vision, or, is there a lack thereof? And is that part of why we still have cities where we have rampant inequality, whether it's the transportation, crisis, housing, land, the list goes on and on. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one for me. I think I've been sometimes quite critical. It's been a long time since there's been, from my perspective as a citizen even, a very clear vision for Cape Town that citizens can rally behind and say, we know where the city is going. We know what the city is going to look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time. We know how a 15-year-old's life is going to be different for the next generation, or that sort of thing. But I also know as a facilitator that when you focus on visioning, you often get stuck, and that's often where a lot of contestation comes in, and that often progress is made by actually just getting stuck in by doing things. And you build trust and you build relationships and you create change by actually just doing actions and by working on projects and actions. So on the one hand, I sort of sympathize with not wanting to invest too much time and effort into sort of visioning processes. But on the other hand, I've felt, and as a citizen, and experienced the kind of lack of aspiration for where we're going, and something that I sort of can resonate with. And people who are interested in the document will see that there's references made to sort of vision statements that are out by other cities, things like the 15-minute city of Paris and the 2019 Bogota city master plan. And I think Young Urbanists didn't put that on the table to say cities like Cape Town must copy that, but more to say, look, other cities have got these aspirations, firstly, and secondly, those aspirational plans were developed in interesting processes. I think especially the South American cases, as Bogota and Sao Paulo and places like that, have developed those aspirational plans in very participatory, co-creation, co-design, often civic-led processes have resulted in the creation of those visions. And there's value in those processes themselves. And we're going to come out of elections now, and a part of the development of this document was building relationships between Young Urbanists and the potential future leaders of the city. After elections, leaders go into now developing the IDPs and adjustment budgets and all of that. And what will be the process for bringing citizens along in the development of those IDPs? Is it just going to be a very technical process where sort of 90% of the IDP is developed by technocrats, and then there's a tick box public participation process? Or are there actually opportunities using new platforms, using civic platforms that have been created even recently? There's been this, like, from my perspective, kind of a surge in civic engagement around wanting to get to know who's running in your ward, and so much interest in what's happening at a local government level. How do we build on that and leverage that? There's new technology, and we have to be cautious of that, because that can also exclude and leave behind a lot of people. But there's a lot of interesting civic engagement apps and planning apps and things like that. How do we leverage that and say, okay, let's do something interesting to bring people along, to create a sort of a vision, and at least have some aspect of that planning that's deeply aspirational and really kind of born of the citizens. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all can agree when you look at any plan, it's hard to understand, us as urbanists, it's hard to navigate, let alone the public. So while, participation is key, we need something with urgency that gives vision and inspiration, but also then the implementation part. So obviously the city has had the comprehensive integration transport plan, but there can be bigger documents that are more inspiring and more, sellable, digestible to the public. So to buy and really to participate and believe, there is a plan to really do something. It's not just something that's hard to understand, opaque, and it's identifying a problem and then implementing that problem. So while, I'm not saying we need to copycat the 15-minute neighborhood concept or the 20 minutes, that's from Melbourne, but there's definitely merit in looking at global North case studies, and also South Bogota was mentioned, and to create something that's really something we can rally around as urbanists and the general public. So visioning is important, and through the document we talk about a lot of stuff going from transportation up until climate change, and we need a brand, we need something that we can rally about and get it behind. I think there was a comment from last night where someone mentioned the Transport Development Authority, TDA, that was just sampled. For some people that meant the city was going in the right direction because it combined transportation and land use planning. So we've actually done something in the past, but how can we get it back without alienating the political divide, whether it's in Cape Town or up north throughout the country. But I think we can go on to the next one, Jody. Any last comments on that?
No, I think it goes nicely into the next one where you've left off now, Roland.
Yes. So the second one is, going from visioning to having the capability of actually implementing these plans. So how do we have a more capable but most importantly, a caring administration? I know Kirsten from Open Streets Cape Town, we had a talk about how the city of Cape Town can transition away from private car dependency. And one of the actions of that talk was, well, we actually need the public administration to actually experience what it's like to walk. Most people walk, or whether it's catching a taxi bus, or whether it's catching My City. What's the lived experiences for them to understand the nitty-gritty of, what it means to be a citizen in a city like Cape Town. So we need a more caring administration, but also a capable administration, because I know from speaking with Jody, we have a big brain drain in not just in the city of Cape Town, but across the country. For example, there's no urban designer currently employed by the city. And we've had a lot of people left the city for whether it's political, whether it's crime, or whether there's better opportunities abroad. The point remains, we need a more capable city, but also a caring administration. I don't know, Jody, did I speak too much there, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you've summed it up really nicely. But I think often it's people who are completely on the outside of the system, or sort of interfacing with the system. We sort of demanding these revolutionary changes, and I think we also have to have empathy for the people who are on the inside, and who are facing huge constraints in terms of capacity, in terms of what legislation does and doesn't allow, in terms of directives and all of that kind of thing. So I think we need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what those constraints are, and help the people who are on the inside to exist and navigate and drive change within what those realities are, rather than kind of shouting from the outside with unrealistic expectations of what can actually be achieved with the capabilities that do exist, rather than a naive expectation of what those capabilities are, because the capabilities are thin and they are challenged by all sorts of demands, and in many South African cities, pressure for corruption and other interests and all sorts of things. So we have to have a a realistic and sophisticated understanding of that and lean into support with that understanding rather than, you know, a naive understanding of those capabilities. And focus on kind of building those capabilities. But I think we've built in the caring part there so that it's not just a technical capability and competency that's built, but that it is focused on this kind of empathy. And, you know, when I was at varsity, this is where my elder young urbanist comes in, the Batapele principles was like drilled into us. And I went to an event earlier this week where we, you know, we're relearning the preamble to the Constitution and all about, you know, respect and equity and justice and dignity. And, you know, my sense is we've kind of lost that along the way a little bit. And so a lot of the recommendations that we make in this report, yes, there's some technical things there around the technical capabilities, the skill sets that need to be reintroduced back into the administration. You mentioned the TDA. There are a lot of people who still support that idea that transport and land use and housing need to be integrated in some way. I personally think you can restructure. There's so many silos, you can restructure them a million different ways. You're never going to have the perfect structure because it's always going to be people who have to work transversely. But I do think those three functions need to be as close together as possible. And then you need to have the capabilities to work transversely, regardless of the structure. But on top of that, we put in these recommendations around capabilities to do community engagement and the right incentives to do that, and to make it fun for officials as well, you know, to build in these activities of going out to do field work and, you know, Kirsten's introduction of things like cycle to work days and cycle through community days and those sorts of activations that reconnect us as practitioners broadly, but officials especially and politicians on a more human level with the communities and the places that they are servicing.
Exactly. It all starts at the top, from the mayor, the deputy mayor, the council. It's all about leadership. And that can really translate into change, organizational change, values, ethics. You know, on behalf of Young Urbanists, for us is we're taught what planning is, and, you know, around evidence-based planning, ethics, the public interest. But when it comes to reality, sometimes those things don't really happen, and it's a bit of a contradiction. So how can we create that change and use that as an example where we, you know, not unlock, but invite talent, but it starts at the top. And if you have the right leadership, you know, as you know, we need bold change, we can really have better outcomes. But the caring part matters. It's a balance between capabilities, but also who do we plan for? What city we want to create? And what do we want to leave behind for our children when we grow up? Because South Africa is an urbanized country. If we don't fix our cities, we can't fix anything. But it's almost 12:30, so I think we'll go to the third one. Jody, do you want to add anything before we go on to the next one?
No, let's move along, Roland. Yeah.
I mean, we mentioned this before, you know, public transportation is important. It's always funny for me, whether, you know, you're an architect or whatever you might be, most planners and activists actually become transportation activists. The reason for this is that transportation is fundamental to everything. It affects your city. So at the moment, since the 60s, of course, with apartheid, we have a car-centric city. So that affects our land users and how we get and how we use our land. So a very key aspect was creating an integrated transport network. And when we mean by transport, we don't just mean trains, but we actually mean things that exist on a metro provincial level, such as the Arabus, My City Bus, but also recognize the role of taxis. A very interesting stat is that around 62% of Cape Townians have access to a taxi in terms of walking meters, so 800, 400 meters, whereas with the bus system, it's only about 12%. So I think it's very important, considering we reached Transportation Day crisis not so long ago. What can we do on a metro level and not use Pretoria as a scapegoat, although it's granted with rail and the opportunities there, but what can we actually do on a metro level? And that's something we kind of focus on this report, because we want to give the next administration of Cape Town ways to navigate this reality on a metro level, because fixing Prasa will take more than 5 years. So I don't know, I've talked a lot on that. Jody, what's your perspective? What can the next administration do around public transportation that's realistic, that will create change now, not and not do that blame game that we've been seeing popping up on the media in the last few months?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a bit of back and forth on some of these recommendations, because I think the emphasis on My City is also controversial, and the sort of viability of expanding stops and all of that is also quite controversial. And for me, the key is in that stat that you gave, that 60% of residents are within walking distance to a taxi route, and that's very, very powerful. That's the core of our public transport arm, or our mass transport sort of system. And obviously fixing rail is a huge part of it. And there's many processes, many of them even driven by national policy in terms of what, how that should be governed and financed and rolled out. So that is a part of it. But for me, so much of it is around recognizing that the local government role in transport will always be one that is more about governance than it is about direct ownership of the infrastructure and the service, and for many reasons. I mean, obviously there's the roads and certain infrastructure that municipalities are responsible for, but transport as a service is highly uncertain and highly disruptible. We've seen that with the introduction of e-hailing and with delivery services. Taxis obviously provide a huge volume of the service, and there's been lots of different attempts to regulate and formalize, and that word formalize is also very tricky and complicated. Just I think the call there should be sort of make it more dignified and sort of equitable for all participants in that system. So for me, the main thing is that there was, in the discussion earlier, there was a lot of discussion around sort of mind shifts that need to happen within the public service. And for me in transport, there needs to be this mind shift change from being around, that we're ever going to sort of fully own all of the transport services, to actually one where we need to strengthen our ability to build relationships and to govern and to enable and regulate in that space. And so that's the first part. And then the second part is around improving all of the supporting urban realm and kind of urban experience aspects of transport. So people are walking to taxis and trains. That's what they're doing. Often our data doesn't show it because we focus on the peak traffic data in all our reporting and measurements and things like that. So we look at the peak hour, and that's totally biased to people who have jobs. And so we, all our data is skewed to people who have jobs and people who are getting in the car or using some form of public transport to get to work, but formalized work. If you expand it to a full day, suddenly you have a very different picture of people who are walking around and for much more different sort of range of activities in their lives. And that's the kind of second part. So after governance, it really needs to be about improving that whole urban realm that's linked to your range of motorized transport services and rail transport services, which is really about making it comfortable and safe and dignified for people to walk and cycle, but primarily walk around neighborhoods and to their transport connections. Yeah,
I mean, I think the emphasis here is that it's all about perception, and I always joke and when I talk to people, what's your favorite destination in Europe? And they always say, or where to go to, and they would cite different places in Europe, Paris, London, whatever it might be. And then I always ask them, what do all the places have in common? And they're like, it's in Europe, or they don't know. But what they have in common is they are designed for people, not for cars. Now, I know we all have cars, including myself. We all have realities. We have safety, architecture of fear. So there are certain realities. But I think the point here is that if you build the right infrastructure, people will use it. And it's also the economical argument to make. Congestion costing the city billions on a yearly basis. Space that's allocated to cars means lost productivity. So for us, it's how do we communicate that, and how do we provide buying currency from the public, because all we have cars, from whether it's the middle class, whether it's the poor, there's really, we can't go on like this because of the cost. People spend more than 60% low income workers on transportation, yes, because of urban sprawl. And so we really need something that's equitable, that can change not just how we go from A to B, but also how it affects our land users, walkability. That's so important. Paris is a great example. I know it's global north, but it showed under bold leadership, Paris became a cycling city overnight through COVID. And that's something very important because it's economical. Buying a bicycle, it's much cheaper than buying a car. I think we all can do the maths on that. So when we talk about public transportation, it's so many things, and we need to kind of realize who has access to what. And we kind of have to kind of include the both formal and informal. And I think taxis have an important role, e-railing, but it's also about communication and, arguing the economical, but also the climate benefits of that. The biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is cars. And then people will go, okay, electrical cars. But what does electric cars mean? Exactly the same. They have the same space in terms of what they take up. So it affects our land users. So all these documents about inclusivity, walkability goes out of the door if we think technology will solve the problem, when it's just exacerbating it. And also, of course, we're a coal-dependent country, but that's a different conversation. There's a lot to talk about this, but Jody, anything to add on this third but critical point?
There's a question in the chat box around, there's I guess a comment around, how many practitioners actually use public transport, and, challenging people around, how qualified are we to do this if we don't use that? And I think that's very, very valid. I do use public transport, and I'm very known for being the person who always says, well, your models are wrong, because I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings where people are saying, there's excess capacity in the licenses for minibus taxis. And I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I'm sitting in those minibus taxis and there's 21 people in the minibus taxis. You need to issue new licenses because they're all full. Or sitting in a train and the trains are jam packed. But people are saying, no, well, they're only 80% full. I'm like, no, that's because some people aren't buying tickets. They're getting off at the station before there's good security, and they know which stations don't have good security. And, so that's not showing in your ticket numbers, but promise you the trains are full. And, people are like, no, the data says, and the data are what's going into our models. And so, and that's just like a very basic, that's just a data example beyond any of the other very complex lived experiences that you learn about in terms of physical safety and harassment and impact on life of delays and all of those other things. So people should definitely be getting out there and familiarizing themselves with what it's really like. And then there's a question around what a devolved concessioned rail network would look like. And I think that's very key to the debates now around, well, what is devolution? And a lot of people misunderstand that in terms of, are we devolving all the assets with the land and the trains and the functioning of Metro Rail, or is it just devolving the mandate to operate it? But Metro Rail would still be an independent entity that would then have a license to operate and contract with, the city or province and that sort of thing. And those are all the sort of details that need to be worked out, and different political parties and different spheres of government have different opinions on. if we go back into history, our rail network was developed by private companies that then operated their own concession companies on that, and then it was nationalized. So it would almost be like maybe going back to some of how it was originally run. And there's pros and cons of that, because part of, I don't know, maybe this is too much detail, but part of why Cape Town has so many lines going into the central city was because there were two companies, one that ran the Northern Line and one that ran the Southern Line, and they came together at Salt River, and they couldn't form agreement to join at Salt River and run into the central city. And have one line that both were allowed to operate their routes on. So they both had lines from Salt River into the central city. So, you know, there's always risk of that sort of thing. So there has to be like one network with concessionaires running on the network, so you don't have that sort of wastage happening. And we could still undo some of that wastage and develop some of that land. But I mean, yeah, I can talk about this for quite a long time. For me, the biggest thing, and it's a pet project for me, is the Blue Downs rail link. You know, apart from just finishing the modernization plan and the signaling and getting our existing network sort of up and running again, that is the biggest sort of, the term isn't life, but game changer for Cape Town in terms of connecting the Metro Southeast to Bellville. And being able to connect that whole market and unlock a lot of development opportunity in an area where land is still relatively affordable, and suddenly a whole new model for land value capture. And you know, there's something really interesting could be done there in terms of how you could finance jointly potentially that concession plus development models there. You know, it could be really interesting to have partnerships with developers and rail operators for those precincts. There's 4 new train stations would be developed along that line. So yeah, it's very, very, for me, that would be the kind of focus of a new network.
Yeah, so I think just to summarize, there's different ways that the next administration can approach this, and I think that's very important to, that's realistic. Obviously, you need cooperation from both entities and communication and trust. And then secondly, we have a history of lots of rail and infrastructure. And the argument there is the capacity of rail is much greater than taxis in terms of, and also potential affordability as well. And then the third point is that if we have up and running existing rail corridors, especially that Jody just summarized around Bellville, it means it unlocks potential of kind of, you know, your 50-minute neighborhood concepts around these key rail corridors, you know, gentle densification, which is going to be another point. I think it's the next point essentially. So there's a lot of benefits and an application of why rail needs to come back, but also as per the initial point, there's other things that can be done, you know, assuming that both the national and the next administration won't come on the same page and actually solve this big crisis we have, not just in Cape Town, but across the country and indeed the continent. But I'm going to go on to the next one. A lot to talk, but all interrelated. And again, any questions, please put them down in the comment sections below. And then afterwards, everyone will be welcome to unmute themselves and we just have an organic conversation. So obviously we just talked about public transportation and we kind of mentioned and touched on active mobility. So active mobility is anything from cycling to e-scooters. And then, you know, something that's quite big, street design. You know, in this report, we kind of said this is the biggest weapon for the Metro because they have control over these two things. Just to give everyone kind of a summary, the next financial budget for the City of Cape Town, only 2% has been allocated to non-motorized transportation. So that's just a very fancy word of anything that doesn't involve around cars. So for us, it's actually communicating, like we mentioned, economical benefits, the environmental benefits, but also this is the biggest weapon for the next administration, how we design our streets And how do we actually, if we build the right infrastructure, people will use cycling. For example, we have cycling lanes in Woodstock, we have cycling lanes on Bay Street in the CBD and across the city, but those cycling lanes are not safe at all, and they're not integrated part of a bigger network, as the third point kind of demonstrated. So, I mean, Jody, I mean, obviously cycling is sometimes viewed as an elitist thing, but the arguments that we have seen from Open Streets and other advocacy organizations, this is the more equitable economical argument. I mean, just to give a summary, the city of Johannesburg they have a bold plan to build cycling lanes, but there was big opposition from political parties like the EFF. You know, does that hold water, or, you know, what is the role of active mobility street design for more equitable, just Cape Town?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we just talk about bike lanes alone, it can come across as sort of very elitist and an important sort of imported concept. If you look at how it was done in South American context, it was part of a sort of a deep democratization of how city budgets and street design was done. So recognize that the majority of people do not have the affordability of access to a car, and that the public street infrastructure budgets should not be biased towards spend on infrastructure that is dedicated to cars. So parking spaces and highways only benefit those who can really afford a car. So rather use that budget to go into infrastructure that people who walk and bike, you know, can use, because everybody can afford that infrastructure. So that's the sort of democratization of the street allocated sort of budget argument. To take it a step further is the sort of economic argument of what that mobility opens up in terms of access to space on the street. And there's a lot of studies around active street frontages, and you know, if people are walking or cycling, they're more likely to stop along the way and buy something or shop or that sort of thing. And so it sort of creates this vibrancy or this productivity in the urban realm. I do think in our context, we have to be quite careful of that it can lead to gentrification, because there is this scarcity of environments that are such good quality and so nice and safe and vibrant, that when we create spaces like that, it can lead to gentrification. So we have to be very careful about where we do it and how we do it and why we do it and for whom we do it. Are we doing it for the developers' interests, or are we doing it for the community's interests, etc.? And there's an activation on Saturday as a part of this program to go to the Langa Bicycle Hub. And the Langa Bicycle Hub is a project that is about active mobility in Langa, which is a township in Cape Town. It's one of the older townships, and its focus has been more about using bicycles during COVID initially to provide access to medicines and food and healthcare to those who couldn't leave home. And now it's grown into more than that, into a sort of a recreation program, teaching children how to cycle safely, trying to create a culture of cycling as an alternative form of mobility, slightly faster. Many people can't afford a car. It's a slightly faster way of getting around than walking. But one thing that's interesting there is that the city have built some infrastructure there. They've built a skate park and pump track and things like that for people with an interest in biking and skating as a recreational activity. And that's become quite, it hasn't even opened yet, and it's become quite a contested space, because people want to now know who controls that space, because everybody wants access to it, to put a container up, to run a business. And that to me actually demonstrates the point really instantly, that access to these spaces equals economic opportunity, and there's a scarcity of these spaces, so it becomes contested. So we have to be kind of thinking from planning and design around who's got access, who's it for. You know, we've got such a scarcity of it, we have to be doing it times a million, not just one small little intervention. And part of our recommendations here is also about incorporating this sort of street design into new human settlements projects. and going back into areas where we've done sort of large scale housing only projects, and not only introducing non-motorized transport design, but introducing access to economic opportunity along those same routes, so that the two go hand in hand with one another.
Jody, someone raised their hand.
Yeah.
Who's that? Please unmute yourself. Someone raised
my hand.
I mean, great question, Jody. Do you have something to say?
I was just going to ask about, what do you think is the main challenge limiting cities to improve active mobility and street design?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to give that over to you quickly.
So I think active mobility alone is probably safety. South African cities have a huge problem with safety. So if you just want to focus on, what's preventing people from getting out and moving around, the people who do are doing it purely out of necessity because they have no other way of getting around, and they're doing it at great personal risk. Let's be honest, and they're often doing it in spaces that don't feel great, dusty, unshaded, and not good lighting, and all of that. Like, let's be honest, that's the majority experience. There's nice examples where that's not true, but that's the majority experience. And so I think the biggest, and even in some communities where safety isn't such a big concern, or isn't such a big reality, it's still the back of mind concern. And so people won't easily put their child on a bicycle to go to school because they'll feel like a terrible parent if something ever did happen, etc. So the safety thing has to go hand in hand, and it's a chicken and egg of like activating spaces so they become safe, but safety has to be there. So it's a big kind of community plus design thing. And then street design, a part of it I think is not having in place good sort of design guidelines and policy and things like that influence it. A lot of it is some sort of legacy things around the way in which we developed historically, our suburbs, our townships, the way in which our human settlements budgets are allocated. So we only do big sort of RDP projects and things like that, and we can't use those budgets to also put in place economic infrastructure and put in place sort of other infrastructure in the same project and things like that. So the constraints of those budgeting regimes do have an impact on it. And then developer interests also play a role, where there's this constant sort of negotiation between what the developer is willing to spend money on and is willing to include in their development or not, and wants to build a mall rather than wants to develop, redevelop a precinct or a corridor, etc.
Yes. So I'm going to intervene you, Jody. It's just we're running out of time. Apologies. I think we can talk for ages and hours. And there's a great comment from Michael saying, through this point, we can really drive spatial transformation, and that's that power. So I think that, what Jody was talking about, equity, but also safety. And I think the point is, if you build the infrastructure, people will use it. It's as simple as that. It needs to be safe. But for us, as one of the most unequal societies in the world, including the city of Cape Town, we need to really look at that equitable and then also the safety aspects as well. If I want children, I want them to be safe on streets, where it doesn't matter where in the city they are. And at the moment, that's not reality, whether it's Scene Point in a very wealthy established neighborhood, or whether it's in an informal area. We want safety, and how we use our streets and how we go from A point to B is very important. But it's important that we talk about the economical argument, because for us, with our unemployment rate, we need to unlock these economical opportunities. In the chat, I've put some links to some studies that kind of affirms this point, because that's a real, opportunity. Is how do we communicate to both business, private sector, those in government and politics, the economical opportunity of this, and then it will actually address the equitable, the safety, the environmental. So it's all about communication for us, but there's a real opportunity to drive positive economic inclusion around street design and active mobility. But I think we're going to go on to the next point. Jody, is there anything else you want to quickly say before we move on?
Maybe just to say that, there are many people who are walking as their primary mode of getting around, or at least walking as far as the taxi, etc. And if we can make that experience slightly safer and slightly more dignified in terms of the quality of that urban realm, those people will continue to walk. So, I think focusing on that is as important as trying to get people who are in their cars out of their cars.
Yes. There's an opportunity. I mean, we need to communicate. So the studies that we cited, that business owners have perception, like in established areas like Sea Point, Green Point, that people drive to their premises, where the opposite is true. I live in very privileged. I live in a high roads in Green Point, and I walk to places like Giovanni's Woolworths, very privileged, of course, and this is a very exceptional reality. But the economical argument is to make there. And then we can have more space for housing, public spaces in these areas, because how much land is actually allocated to parking, and then also whatever we are building, going forward, that it captures these very key themes that we've touched upon, and which is a nice little segue to the next one, which is gentle density. If I can change. So obviously, designing on streets is important, but what about the buildings, right? And something that we do need to talk about is densification. And usually that's a very naughty word, or you have a certain reaction. But what we want to emphasize in the report, there's a fundamental difference between bad densification and good densification. It's actually quite simple. So what we're advocating for is gentle density. Now, it does say 3 to 5 stories, because we were scared that we'll alienate the people we send this report to. We mentioned 3 to 5, but in actual fact, if you look at Paris, it's 8 levels, 9 levels. So essentially, good density, gentle density entails anything from 3 to 8. Places like Stellenbosch, another great opportunity. It has the right layout, but they're missing a few levels to accommodate more people, whether it's housing, mixed uses, because what that means, it drives more capacity, and also it drives more people to businesses and drives economic opportunity, and it's smartly using the land we have in a very urbanized country, because we need to think about food security in terms of urban sprawl. The city is expanding, it doesn't have a urban edge. So, why does urban density matter, Jody? And, what are the barriers, I guess, in terms of implementation? Do we have an urban framework in the city? And if we do have one, how are we implementing it?
Sure. So some people might have heard me talk about this morning already, and I spoke about how densification alone was sort of not going to be enough to solve all of our problems in terms of economic inclusion and sort of social barriers to inclusion and integration and that sort of thing as well. So I think, yeah, with that sort of thought still in mind, some of the barriers to densification partly is just our market. 53% of our growth is informal. And that's not because we haven't done the zoning right or haven't thought about building taller buildings. It's because of the economic reality of our city and the economic reality and the affordability levels of people who are living in our city. So the densification can't really solve for that. We need public housing, and we need social housing, and we need subsidized housing. And we need that to also be denser and in well-located areas, and that's part of the discussion and part of what needs to be solved for. So that's a big part of it, and we are nowhere near at the scale that can provide for that 53% of our growth that is in that very low income market. The other part, of course, is that the market itself has preferred to develop gated communities on the periphery, and it's because there's certain efficiencies there in terms of the value of the land and of what the market itself is, as in the end consumer is saying they want, in terms of being able to have a swimming pool and place for their kids to ride around, and the perception of safety in that environment definitely plays into it, and that sort of thing as well. And I think our city planners and our city leaders and people at the Municipal Planning Tribunal and that sort of thing haven't played a strong enough role in terms of reining that in and redirecting the market to other forms of development. And I think often in the imagination of those debates, it's a gated estate versus a block of flats, where it's actually could be a gated estate versus densification of a suburb. So you still could be living in a suburban sort of environment, but in a slightly more dense form of that, which might be slightly more, appealing to the sort of the end consumer of that market is sort of trying to actually sell a housing product to at the end of the day. So I've said a few things there, but yeah. Yeah,
I think there's two parts in here. It's honestly, having an urban design framework, so anything that we built, it gives to those key kind of principles around what good density and urban framework looks like, but also existing buildings, because they are private land. How do we get buying ownership from the business? Because if the business sector supports this, then we can unlock so much economic opportunity. There was a comment again from Michael that the potential about density and what it means and efficiency around creating new spaces and opportunity and more economic outputs. So I think there's two aspects here around urban governance and the private sector, because usually business owners have a what we call a NIMBY response. NIMBY stands for not in my neighborhoods. And this all goes back to how we design our streets and how we go from point A to B. But for us as a city, we need buy-in from all sectors. And that's, I think, it's quite important, whether it's the next administration, but most importantly, the private sector, because if the private sector can come on and support good density, we can actually have more economic output. It means more money for them. And that's the opportunity as urbanists, and also to solve our other issues that relate to apartheid, spatial planning, and also creating a more inclusive, walkable and integrated city. But we're almost out of time, so I'm going to go to the next point. Jody, anything you want to say before we go on?
No, that's fine. We 60 minutes for 6 ideas, and we crashing through it.
I think we are, and obviously if you need to go at 1, please do. We will stay on to have a discussion. And Jody, if you have to go also, please. So I forgot to ask you. But the 6 points is very simple. It kind of sums everything up that we've been talking about is regeneration. We've mentioned secondary CBDs. The second CBD is Balfour, for those who do not know, but we have other modes. A big theme across urban planning in developed North and South countries is kind of decentralization. While we always like to talk about rights to the city, there's actually opportunities. And this also kind of formed a key question, part of last night's discussion, is how do we, will whoever is running, whoever ever going to be the next administration in direct investment into these informal areas. I remember a great a discussion around, the Soccer World Cup, where not to defend anyone, but where Helen Zeller wanted the stadium not to be in a city bowl. So because if you ever been to the stadium, the things we just talked, the walkability, the urban realm, the quality, public spaces, it creates change, and that's a change we need. So how do we do regeneration through our secondary CBDs, and more importantly, informal areas? Because if you look at the formal economy, it contributes a lot of money to society. There's always a misconception, it's always the formal and mallification that drives economic output, but the informal economy is big, it's large, and needs to be part, and we need to integrate this informal versus formal to have a more inclusive one city. I mentioned a lot, and we do have a big comment from Daniel, but Jody, I'm just going to quickly jump to you. How do we lead this regeneration to these areas we just mentioned?
Yeah, so I mean, I saw there was a comment earlier about Washington Street in Langa, and that's, you know, one of the areas that we mentioned in the report. We mentioned Langa and Bonteheuvel, Athlone, and you know, I think there's several areas that come to people's minds. Khayelitsha CBD and Puleni, the picture that we started this presentation with. These are sort of like forgotten areas, when not for the people who live there, but for often, you know, planners and people who talk about Cape Town on the global stage and things like that. It's Bellville and the CBD, and Bellville, you know, has only been talked about, hasn't really sort of gotten right in terms of the big plans and visions for that area. And obviously, urban management is a key part of it, is a good starting point. For anything is sort of getting those basic services and just sort of management of the area right, in terms of cleaning and greening and safety and that sort of thing, in a sort of a humane and fair way to all users of the space, I think is important. In the South African context, increasingly urban management is associated with displacement and harassment of groups as well. And then I think, you know, looking at interesting modes of supporting and attracting businesses. So you know, you talk about the 15-minute city. What does it look like in these contexts? And we have a lot of big vertically integrated companies in South Africa. And they do a lot for our economy. They employ a lot of people, but they also extract a lot from communities when they operate them, and everything they extract goes to surplus profits at a very, very high level. And if you compare that to ancient cities or many other cities in the world that are that do not have so many sort of big monopoly kind of firms in them, you'll see much more sort of owner-operated businesses in communities. Everybody knows the plumber by name. The hardware is, you know, Suleiman's hardware shop, and the butcher is, you know, they know the butcher, the baker, and the shoemaker, quite literally. And how do we recreate that in our community, so that money and that circulation and that trade and the trust and the relationships and all of that is existing in our communities? And some of that exists in just the informal businesses that happen in the relationships and the trade and stuff that's happening on the streets. And in some of our communities, street trade is also street manufacturing and welding and things like that. And how do we kind of protect that and make sure that as that grows and the economy of that area grows, it stays owner operated and owner business, and doesn't become, and this maybe some people will disagree with this, but doesn't become one of these big monopoly firms where the surplus profit is going to be extracted from that community and go to some sort of account very high up outside of that community. So for me, that needs to form a part of the regeneration thinking.
Yes.
Yeah, and then the other part we speak about in the report is also the informal settlements, and just informal settlement upgrading and providing a decent layout and a decent grid structure to informal settlements, so that informal settlements residents can also have the dignity of having an address. An address is so important to so many functions in life. So many things you are blocked from being able to do as a resident in society, taking a book out of a library, reporting a crime, reporting a rape, and being able to say where exactly that rape took place. There's so many things that you are not able to do if you do not have an address, and being able to locate where something happened and things like that. So just being able to provide a decent grid structure to informal settlements, and provide people with an address, and provide good services in terms of water and sanitation, and ideally electricity and Wi-Fi. Electricity without load shedding would be great as well. I think is the basics before we even get to anything further of regeneration for informal settlements.
I mean, interestingly, malls are on decline, not just because of COVID, but before COVID. So, and, it kind of, because malls is kind of the epitome of urban sprawl and car-centric developments and kind of contradicts everything that we've been talking about, is we actually have a real opportunity to unlock these secondary CBDs in formal areas. But I think a key point Jody mentioned is the money needs to stay in these communities. Well, I mean, a point from Michael that, big corporates like ShopRite and Picker have adapted and they're doing quite well. We need a decentralization and demonopolization of where the money goes. Now, of course, ShopRite and Pick n Pay invest back into the local market and indeed across the continent, but there's an application of having local corporates and also kind of more mom and dad business owners in these areas. But it starts with the basic, which is kind of lacking, especially in formal areas. So there's, the trends are going in the right direction, but also we have a digital divide. So not everyone can shop on the 90 Minutes app or whatever, Take-A-Lot or whatever a lot of people are doing these days. But we need to actually change the build form so to accommodate a more thriving, economic-driven city, and informal areas are the best opportunities because they actually have the good layout in terms of what we're talking about density, but it's actually about reinforcing and making them great quality urban realms, and giving people the basics like addresses, like what Jody was mentioned. Now it is almost 1 o'clock. But essentially, we've linked the whole report into documents, and I do implore everyone to have a look and share and ask any questions. You can email us. I've put an email address. Jody, please put your email address in there as well, because Jody knows much more than we do. And also, do follow us on social media and engage with us. But Jody, in terms of the 6 pointers, are any comments, and then we're going to go into any questions and just have an organic discussion. And I do encourage anyone to unmute themselves, put the video on, and but I do understand if you have to go because it's already been past the hour that we initially promised. Okay, any comments on the 6th point, or can I go to the last one? Hi, Jody.
No. I don't have any comments. I think Michael has his hand up.
Yes, definitely. Michael, please unmute yourself.
I was going to say, in terms of informal areas, I think COVID also illustrated a lack of government funding in public goods. We speak about the RDB program where the government has been focusing on building housing, but not settlements. You can see that in the fact that during COVID, when people need to go collect grants, they have to travel kilometers to simply go to a post office, which is most likely going to be offline. So, one thing the government could do to these communities could be investing in public goods such as post offices, police stations, state services closer to the communities that will essentially improve the standards of living.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And yeah, sometimes there's a scary trend to focus too much on sort of rationalization or efficiency seeking sort of measures, rather than accessibility as the kind of key measure, and actually use that as an anchor around which to create a place. So yeah, don't only sort of think about, well, is it going to be worth the sort of investment in building a library or a payment office or whatever it is, just for that, and then measure it just on access. It's like, what can we build around that in terms of placemaking? And the big thing has got to also be, what other kind of economic activities can we put around that? Because that's always what communities complain about, is say, well, we don't have anywhere to run our businesses from. So build also a center that people can run their businesses from, and the numbers will make sense.
I mean, yes, definitely. From all the 6 points, they actually found, this goes back to the first point of visioning. It needs to entail all these things, and then also having the capability of implementation, whether it's transportation, urban design, to regeneration. And that's the opportunity, and this can be all done on a metro level, guys. So this is not, you don't need to have Praza necessarily working or SAPs. You can actually drive a lot of change and change people's lives, their decisions. The build form affects your decisions, your behavior, your mental capacity. The list goes on and on. So there's a big opportunity, and in a way, no excuses from any city to use anyone as a scapegoat for why we don't have X, Y, or Z. These things exist across the world. Obviously, we can't copy and paste, but what we can do is we can understand our past, and we can understand where we're going, and we can use the metropolitan governance to create real change, urgent change. That's a great question, Michael. Anyone else have any questions or any comments? Please, I encourage you to unmute and ask. This is a safe space. I will not put this part of the recording, so you can ask anything, please. We do not bite. No one. Yes, I think it's already past one, and it's probably time to go get lunch. So if anyone doesn't have any questions, I'm just gonna ask Jody any final comments before we end this discussion. I do want to thank everyone for joining, and of course to Jody for being a role model to us at Young Urbanists and helping with all these things from the mail discussion to this report, and also for our Future Cities in the South African Cities Network for making the Urban Festival month around the Rebuild City a reality for us to really talk about these important issues, but also hopefully create positive change.
Thanks, Roland. I think for me, we covered a lot of different topics and a lot of, each one could have been a session on its own. But I think what's exciting for me is what Young Urbanists actually did here. The Young Urbanists put together a document and went to people who are in the running to be the future leaders of our city and said, we want to engage you on our ideas on what's important for the city. And that to me is very exciting, that young actors in this space took the initiative to do that, and that potential future leaders of our city listen. Well, we don't know if they're going to act on it, but they were open to hearing the ideas. And yeah, it would be interesting to hear if similar things have happened in other cities, if there's other networks doing similar things. It doesn't have to be an election to do it. So really encourage other people in your own spaces, in your own cities, whether it's at a ward level or a metro level, national level, why not? Let's do more of this sort of thing.
Yes, it's not just about election cycles, it's about accountability and being active citizens. And it's hard because I think it's very privileged to be an activist, and I mean, some instances a necessity, but also we all have responsibilities, full-time jobs and realities that govern our lives. I do encourage everyone who is enrolled to vote. It's a hard thing, it's important, but also to have these discussions like what Jody was saying on a ward level. Jody, what's that link again where you can find out who's your candidate? I think that might be something worth sharing to our audience. I just forgot the link.
I'll put it in the chat box. It's mycandidate.opencities.org, I think. My candidate. Let me double check that. My candidate.opencitieslab.
So essentially what this tool does, it gives you an idea of who's running for your candidates. And something that I've done in my own council is that you can actually contact your councillor. If they're not responsive, then it speaks volumes about themselves. It's important to note that with the local government election coming up, you have a vote for your councillor, and then you have a vote for the PR system. Those are two different things, and they count 50% each. But it's important that you have a relationship to your councillor and they're responsive, and potentially they want to do and they agree with the change that's needed, whether it's in that council or across the city. Perfect. Thanks, Jody. I do appreciate. So please, we would encourage everyone to use that. Please share this document. Please contact either Jody or myself or both of us if you have any questions or any opportunities around this, because we will be using this going forward, not just when the elections is done, but afterwards, because for us as Young Urbanists, we want to hold those accountable, whether it's the opposition or the next administration, because if we don't fix our cities now, we not to be alarmist, but we won't be able to create a country we envisioned in 1994. We are an urbanized country, and the role of planning is important because it was weaponized during apartheid, but it has the same potential to create a more inclusive, integrated and climate friendly city going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to end this call. Any last questions, please do them now. Otherwise, we'll give it 2 more minutes and then we'll end it. Jody, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate that as always. And thanks everyone for coming. I think we need to go for lunch. I am hungry. Okay. Happy for me to end it, Jody?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jody. I hope everyone has a wonderful Thursday. Thursday it is, yes. Okay. Cheers.